I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report, the show that goes there. Stacy.
Hey, well, we have been tracking inflation, right? For the past few months, it's looking worse and worse and worse. Well, we have on our hands feeding the racket, starving the racket. Feeding the racket is the central banks feeding the grift, right, of this whole global Ponzi scheme, fiat Ponzi scheme that's been going on for 50 years now, since 1971. And Bitcoin is starving the racket. We're going to start off with this story out of Korea. This is Nexon, which is a $30 billion gaming company. And Nick Carter tweets a link to their statement on why they bought 1,717 Bitcoin. M1 posting isn't just for coiners and gold bugs. $30 billion Korean conglomerate do it too. And with government spending and debt levels so high, even a small rise in interest rates would make paying down the debt even more difficult than it already is. So central banks have been increasingly monetizing the debt, printing money to loan to the government in the form of buying government bonds at low interest rates. Since January 2020, the U.S. has printed 40% more U.S. dollars than previously existed. We are not privy to conversations at central banks or departments of treasuries, but we foresee no end to this in the near term. And then they go on to say, while we can't predict what interest rates will do, we can see that the inflation is going to eat away our treasury.
Right, that's $100 million that they bought in Bitcoin. And, this is the echo of the 1971 day when gold window was closed by Richard Nixon. We went on an all-fiat standard. And within a few decades, as Nomi Prinz writes about in her book Collusion, all global central banks were colluding on this money printing scheme that would devalue everyone's currency, their purchasing power. And then starting with Michael Saylor at MicroStrategy here in the United States, his company, and now there are almost 40 companies, and now companies in Asia are launching what you would call speculative attack. They're calling the central planners and the central bankers bluff. They're saying, ha, we see you, you're printing trillions, and we're going to buy Bitcoin with that, and we're going to defund you. Similar to what Soros did in 1993 to the Bank of England. But this is done now on a global scale, a multi-$100 trillion scale, and that's why Bitcoin price is going to 500, 600, 700,000.
Well, many have said that we're in a similar situation to the Great Depression. And the Great Depression, of course, also saw geopolitical game theory happening and beggar thy neighbor. I think it was the UK who actually pulled themselves off the gold standard first, then, or revalued gold in order to diminish their own debts and try to fight the deflation. So you're seeing the same thing on the other side here as rapid money printing just accelerates. And in an all fiat world, it's difficult to protect yourself as a company with hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars on your balance sheet. So how do you protect yourself? We saw with Tesla's earnings report just in the past week, we saw that obviously they made a lot of money. It was a good decision that they made to convert some of their, it was like $1.7 billion worth of their balance sheet that they converted to Bitcoin, and that has helped keep their earnings up. But an interesting thing, so Nexon in Korea mentions that they're not privy to how central banks and treasuries plan on what they're doing with this money printing and whether or not it'll ever end. They predict it won't end. But there was a member of parliament in Canada who released a video of him questioning the central bank head of the Central Bank of Canada. And he notes that the Trudeau government is borrowing $3 billion a week. You'll never guess how much the central bank is printing per week. So he asked the central banker how much quantitative easing they were currently engaged in, and the guy admitted to $3 billion a week. And this Canadian member of parliament was like, how convenient, because we're also borrowing $3 billion a week.
Right. So again, this is confirming on a global basis from different governments and different politicians are waking up to the fact that the central banks are printing with the stated goal of helping the unemployed and to stimulate the economy. And as politicians and corporate CEOs are pointing out, that stated goal is increasing unemployment and increasing the loss of purchasing power and increasing the plight of the poor. It does help those who are asset holders. they are becoming fabulously rich. So the split between rich and poor is growing spectacularly. And in that video, it's amazing because the politician points out the obvious failure by the Central Bank of Canada to make any sense. He says that they have a 2% inflation target in the video, and the politician says, you've already blown past 2%, and you're causing real painful inflation everywhere. And the central banker simply keeps repeating like a monkey on drugs, the same talking points, right? They have no cognitive ability to understand. They're programmed to do this. They might as well just have a rhesus monkey I think a rhesus monkey would do better than these bots, these Keynesian bots.
Well, certainly, as you mentioned, the asset prices are indeed going up, creating the cantillionaire class. In Canada, it's quite extraordinary. We've reported that U.S. house prices have been up 16% in the past year, thanks to all the money printing. In Canada, it's up 32%. So the average price increase in some provinces are $100,000 over the year, the median price. So you are choosing a group of winners that are in the lucky house club. They happen to be old enough when prices were not this high before all the money printing began, and so they own the assets, and it consolidates their the wealth and income gap, the wealth gap, most importantly. In this article that Edward Harrison, for example, links to, the housing boom is ripping apart the financial fabric of Canadian life. Young adults increasingly feel shut out of home ownership in big cities, even as their parents can't stop talking about how much money they've made as owners. So you have that intergenerational gap that we've warned about for over 10 years now here on Keiser Report. But the problem especially is that there are some really big winners, like the boomers who owned property in Toronto or outside Vancouver or any of these big cities. They're able to extract, they take the HELOCs, the home equity loan out of their property, take some equity out and give it to their children to get on this property ladder that's going up by 30% a year. So you're gifting them $100,000 a year income in money printing.
It's nepotism plus despotism is what we've got going on around the world, and all these different. It's so obvious now to everybody, including the rank and file politician, that the money printing causes the poverty, increases the wealth and income gap, and increases the unemployment and the social misery that comes with it. So what we've been saying now for at least 5 years, pointing out, we've had bankers and academics and students, and we've been talking about this for 5 years. And 5 years ago, it was considered to be a theory or a heterodox theory. Mm-hmm. Now it's become an accepted wisdom, fact. That's what investigative journalists do.
You don't even need to be an investigative journalist to find this out. We're going to look at this tweet from Ben Askren, who is an MMA fighter. So a boxer has had his head punched in a few times. And even though he's been punched around quite a few times in his life, he tweets, curious if this will be reflected in the CPI. They want you to think that inflation doesn't exist. Rolling eyes, rolling eyes, rolling eyes emoji, Bitcoin. And that is would cost to build a deck. So they look at the average lumber prices using 2,400 board feet, which is 200 square feet. April 2020, it cost you $936 to build a deck. Now it costs you $3,696, which is I guess that's fourfold if I could do some math here.
Right. Well, here's the thing. Over the last 20 years, China was operating as a wage sink, right? All the wages and the jobs went to China, and their cost of labor was one fraction of what it was in North America. But now that's caught up, you've got wage parity between China and the U.S. So you don't have that wage sink anymore. So now the cost for stuff, the average person down there at the box store is and energy and food is up sharply, and board to build houses. It's simply now going to spill over the dike that's been put in place to try to hide the fact that we're doing a policy of money printing to help our friends on Park Avenue. That has gone on for 20 years while they outsourced the job to China. Now we've got wage parity, so that wage sink, that was the ability to understate inflation for years is done. And now the numbers that are going to come in are going to show real quarter-to-quarter CPI runaway inflation. And all the policymakers are going to, A, run. You won't find them. The phone will be dead. They're simply going to run away. B, they're going to blame some magical existential threat that they'll pull out of their Hollywood hat and do little films about. But we know that this was completely and entirely avoidable, as we've been saying for 5 years.
Now, you know that there's always those economists or CEOs or business people that once they retire, then they admit, like, oh my God, it's all a fraud. They never do it while they're collecting their huge salaries, the people in the health insurance racket. So here we have, and you and I have been questioning whether, this is the 50th birthday of an all-fiat world will be in August of 2021. We went off the gold standard in August of 1971. So this feels like what we're seeing from the stimulus programs with huge amounts of fiscal stimulus over the past year. This is extraordinary over the past 20 years. We've had massive amounts of central bank loose policies giving credit to the elites of Wall Street. But now it's like, it seems like as it's crumbling globally and deglobalization is setting in, then you get Biden set to unveil a $1.8 trillion expansion of American social safety net. So there seems to be, okay, it's all over. Hey, in the last few moments of this Ponzi scheme, we'll give you some of these crumbs. So, I mean, there are some good policies, like they're giving a lot for childcare, but on the other hand, it's like spewing money for university students, which will support the obviously racket of the whole education system here, which is overpriced, and all these administrators. So basically, they're like very highly paid government sector workers at these universities.
It's the old Times Square three-card Monte trick.
Yeah.
Okay, after the three-card Monte guy rips the tourist off for all the money they have, they let them win the last $20 hand before they go away, big losers. And in the mind of the punter, he's like, aha, I won. So here's Joe Biden. He's Clinton, Biden, neoliberalism, ravaging trillions from the middle class, creating a huge number of the newly poor. And on their way out, they're saying, here, catch this nickel between your teeth and you can keep it. Thanks, Joe. Swell guy.
Very swell indeed.
Oh, yeah, he's swell. He's swollen for sure. Hey, we can't swell or inflate this segment. We got to take a break. When we come back, more on this show. Don't go away. Back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to James Turk of goldmoney.com. Full disclosure, I am an investor. James Turk, welcome back.
Thanks, Max. It's always great to be with you.
All right, we're going to pick your brain on some big issues here. Stock prices are at all-time highs. Property prices are rocketing by double-digit percentage points. Commodities are on a tear. Why are we getting so much monetary and fiscal stimulus if it looks like we are in boom times? I don't get it. Explain.
Too much money printing by central banks around the world. They're debasing currencies. And as a consequence, what you're seeing is the early stages of a flight out of the currency into real things.
So the policymakers tell us something different, right? What do they tell us exactly? How do they get away with this?
They tell us what they want us to hear. They don't necessarily tell us the whole story. And all of this money printing that's going on means that there's a lot of inflation in the climate, and we're starting to see that. Lumber prices, food prices, everything pretty much across the board. People are looking for alternatives to national currencies. And that's why the stock market's going up as well, Max, that it's better to own stocks than to own something dollar denominated, because at least at the end of the year, odds are that the stock will have tangible assets, the value of which will go up in debased dollars. Or if you put dollars in deposit in a bank, you don't earn enough interest income to offset the loss of purchasing power because of inflation. So put your money into things other than dollar-denominated assets.
I hear the words Weimar Germany now. Almost every day I see somebody talking about it. Michael Burry, who, of course, wrote The Big Short, or he participated in The Big Short on Wall Street. They made a movie about it. He was writing about this, comparing the current situation to Weimar Germany, and then he kind of disappeared from Twitter. The 9 years of boom time inflation that ended in hyperinflation is what happened there. And all the time in Weimar Germany, the central bank was saying that the inflation was transitory, that the money printing had nothing to do with these stock prices skyrocketing to new highs. Is the comparison to Weimar Germany, which is a pretty dramatic comparison, is it warranted though, James?
I think it is warranted, Max. And, I think we're on the same path because what's happening is Weimar Germany was spending money. The government was spending money. They were returning to the central bank, the Reichsbank, in order to print the currency. And that's what they did. And that's the same thing that's happening now in the United States. But there's a fundamental difference. The economy in Weimar Germany was a cash currency economy. In other words, at the end of the month, companies used to pay their employees with a pay packet with Reichsmark banknotes stuffed in it. Nobody had a checking account back then. The deposit currency and money on deposit in the banking system was mainly in businesses and not individuals. In the United States today, we have a very different type of currency system. Most transactions are done with deposit currency. It's a very sophisticated banking system. So you're not going to see piles of notes like occurred in Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe. You're going to see an inflation like occurred in Argentina or Brazil, where they had very sophisticated banking systems and everyone had bank accounts. Instead of printing paper, the central bank does bookkeeping and adds zeros to the government's checking account, which the government then spends. So it's hyperinflation. We're on the road to hyperinflation. It's a question of whether they get off of it before the currency is destroyed or whether we go over the cliff.
So the Federal Reserve and the government says that they've got a 2% target on inflation, but they also admit now that we broke through 2%. We're heading to 3%. Shadow Stats, which of course tracks the real inflation, if you were to unwind all the hedonic adjustments and statistical mirages that are put in there to hide it, tells us that inflation's really over 10%, 12% now, in fact. And we see commodities, as you point out, lumber doubling and tripling in price, copper, new all-time high, agriculture, new all highs. And yet, the language that comes out of the central planners is they say, quote, we are fighting deflation. How do they even misuse that word to that degree, James?
Don't listen to what they say. Watch what they're doing. I think that's the key. They talk about things being transitory. Well, the 1970s were transitory, but you had inflation for 10 or over actually 15 years that was decimating. And it's the same thing that's happening now, but we're just at the beginning of this, Max. That's the scary thing. And the Federal Reserve yesterday said they're going to continue printing $110 billion a month of new currencies being created every month by the Federal Reserve.
So looking at some of these corporations, what's going on the corporate level, microchip shortages are hitting production of all sorts of goods from automobiles to smartphones. I saw that Ford just reported numbers for the quarter. They said they're going to reduce capacity by 50% because of a smart chip, reduction. We're seeing shipping shortages develop as stimulus checks to American pour into China for manufactured goods from China. Will we see widespread supply shortages in 2021? So an ancillary impact of this money printing seems to be supply shortages. Is that going to also develop, or we're going to start rationing of goods and things like that, James?
Well, let's hope they don't ration in goods, because price fixing and rationing in that is a step backwards, and it's going to kill the economy even worse than debasing the currency. The shortages come from the problem that you need a sound money in order to perform economic calculation properly. So when a company plans for something, they need to have a sound monetary unit in order to do their investment planning. You can't do that easily in an inflationary economy. The way to do that is to hire an accountant who lived through the Argentinian hyperinflation, who understands how the problems that arise when you're actually in an inflationary environment. Another element of the course, Max, is that a lot of people would rather hoard things or hold things rather than sell them for the prices, because they know that to replicate them at a future date, it's going to cost a lot more. So in an inflationary economy, you do see a lot of shortages occurring. It's not that the stuff doesn't exist. It's just that people would rather hold on to it because at least they have something of value rather than a depreciating currency.
Right. You mentioned sound money. And of course, we've been talking now for over 15 years. We've been having James Turk on, talking to James Turk, and we're always talking about sound money, and gold, of course, has been sound money for a long, long time. And it just seems that what a lot of people miss is that when you are navigating the territory of an economy, you need to have at least one fixed point. You know, if you're sailing on the ocean, you need a North Star. When you're building a house, you need a 12-inch foot standard measurement to use to build your house. Here in this economy, in the global economy since 1971, since it's not gold-backed, we have essentially an ideology-based currency and then an ideology-based definition of what constitutes GDP, right? It's ideology in, ideology out, and it's become ludicrously random. It's just, when I hear Jay Powell and these people talk now, it's like word salads coming out of their mouth, grounded in, it's like an E.E. Cummings poem or something. It makes no frickin' sense, James.
No, you're exactly right. And, you know, it's a very keen point that you're bringing up about having a unit. In money, the unit is called a numeraire. For example, during the British Empire, the numeraire was the British sovereign gold coin, which weighed 0.2435 ounces of gold. It doesn't say on a British sovereign that it's 1 pound, because everybody knew that a British sovereign was 1 pound. It's the same thing originally with the framers of the Constitution when they created, in the Mint Act of 1792, the eagle and a double eagle. Everybody knew what an eagle was, and everybody knew what a double eagle was. It was the numeraire. We don't have a numeraire anymore, Max, and that's the problem.
That applies, I mean, not to be, some people would equate this with a certain conservatism in thought, because they like to go on these wild tangents about how we could all live on a beautiful island of paradise called Shangri-La, where all people are self-actuating in real time. But the result now is that nobody's getting civil rights, nobody's getting human rights, nobody's participating in representational government anymore. It's completely in complete malevolent anarchy in the UK, in the US, and around the world. There's a total societal breakdown, James, for this very reason. Am I exaggerating?
No, you're not exaggerating, because when the currency is no good, the only way you can force that currency into circulation is through laws, penalties, and enforcement, and regimentation. And that's what we're seeing. We're losing our freedoms, we're losing our liberties in order to make this bad currency circulate. You know, again, we're going further and further down this road. We're going to end up like Venezuela if we don't get off this road.
So you've hit the nail on the head there. Because the money's so bad, the only way to get people to use it is through coercion and effectively state violence. And that's what we're seeing in the United States now, is more and more incursion by the state, and with a very violent, extremist, autocratic edge to accept. The problem is they're trying to get people to accept complete garbage as a numeraire, as a unit of account, as something worth working for. And predictably, the results are becoming untenable, if not downright insurrectionist. Now, let's talk about the broader economy a little bit. At the end of the first quarter, the Bank of America argued that the 40-year bond bull market was over, and it's even possible when the central bank is. So they said the bond bull market's over. You know, people have been saying this for at least 15 years. You know, that it's been the widowmaker. People say, oh, the bond market's finished. But at some point, if in fact this currency is as garbage as we're saying, the bond market will in fact, the bull market will in fact end. And that would be the end of a lot of assumptions in terms of how the economy works. But are you willing to delve into the deep end and make a call here about the bond market, James?
I think the bull market in the bonds has already ended. The only reason why it's continued to go on longer than would normally be the case is we don't have a free market anymore. You know, financial repression is the policy of central banks around the world, and they're buying all of these bonds to keep interest rates low. If it wasn't for central bank buying all of these bonds, interest rates on bonds would be much, much higher. We saw a little blip up last year. You know, the bond vigilantes of the 1970s, some people have said are quiet now. Well, the reason why they're quiet is because they're being overrun by central banks. So I think, you know, getting back to what we were talking about on currency and avoiding things that are dollar denominated, avoid dollar denominated bonds, avoid dollar denominated bank deposits, avoid anything dollar denominated, own tangibles or near tangibles like stocks of companies that own tangibles. I think that's the only safe answer going forward from here until we turn around and get off this road toward hyperinflation.
All right, James Turk, we're going to have a second segment. This is just too good. Thanks for being on Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, James Turk of goldmoney.com. Until next time, bye, y'all.